You know what I'm saying? It's that situation when we are living in a war zone.
Hello and welcome back to Between the Facts. In this episode, we're going to look at the life, the death, the fame, the conspiracies surrounding Tupac Shakur. Not something I was overly familiar with before I started. So there was a lot of education for myself. It's not naturally my type of music. And yeah, it was interesting to see how somebody could rise so high but still be caught up in such human things as, falling out with friends and creating our own enemies. Don't forget, we are part of the You podcast network. Strongly recommend you go over to see the other shows. We like to think of ourselves as the home of podcast entertainment. You'll find lots of different movie reviews, looking at horror, for example, true crime podcasts. There's one podcast which I love the name of. You're going to eat that crust podcast. I love the name of that podcast. What am I to say? Pop over, go and see them, listen to some of the shows, leave feedback for them, add them a follow. Not knowing a lot about him, you've got to take a lot of the stuff you read at face value, and some of the quotes, they are assigned to the right people, but let's just dive in. Okay, so it's said that Tupac didn't just make music, he made noise. And I think they mean, the surrounding his life, he stirred emotions, he sparked debates, and even now after his death, years and years later, he's still one of the most talked about figures in hip hop. We see musicians come and go quite frequently, quite commonly, but Tupac is one of those names that will forever be associated with the very early days and the legacy of that music. So yeah, let's get started. We'll have a look at his early years, his rise to fame, the East Coast, West Coast beef, I suppose is one way of putting it, arguments, hatred, and then we'll look at his life. So Tupac was born June 16th, 1971 in East Harlem in New York. His mother, Afeni Shakur, named him Lesanne Parish Crooks, but then renamed him when he was about one after an Incan revolutionary leader, Tupac Amaru Shakur. I think Tupac's mum wanted him to have a name that meant something more, something that people could associate his strength with, or something that he could aspire to. Afeni, his mum, was no ordinary woman. She was a Black Panther at one point, and even part of the famous Black Panther 21, the Panther 21 trial. She was pregnant with Tupac at the time of the trial, but managed to defend herself and was acquitted. A month after that trial, Tupac was born. So you can see from that, even at his earliest days, a month before he was born, Tupac's life was embroiled with the political, the powerful, the unpredictable. But, being a single parent family, life wasn't easy, money would have been tight. And they ended up moving around a lot, particularly within New York, so between Harlem and the Bronx. Then from New York to Baltimore, and ultimately to California. Interestingly, Tupac's stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, was on the FBI's most wanted list. I think that lack of a stable fatherly figure in his life wouldn't have helped, in his approach to life and his outlook. Despite the chaos, Tupac had an undeniable spark. And when they moved to Baltimore, he enrolled in the Baltimore School for Arts. And this is where he starts to see this creative streak come out of him, not only in music, but in poetry and jazz, and For a time, Tupac even trained in ballet. You know, he was in the Nutcracker whilst at the college, and he played the Mouse King. It said he was passionate about Shakespeare and could quote entire soliloquies. His classmates described him as charismatic, sensitive, and deeply thoughtful. Yes, he was a tough kid from the streets of New York, but he was somebody that wanted and did see so much more from the world. After Baltimore, Tupac moved to Marin City in California, which I believe is just north of San Francisco. And that's when he really started getting into the music scene. He joined a local hip hop band called Digital Underground. He was originally a roadie for them, then a backup dancer, and then became a featured rapper within the act. His first appearance as a rapper was Same Song by Digital Underground. In 91, Tupac dropped his debut solo album, Tupacalypse Now. Good name, actually. I like that. Tupacalypse Now. It was raw, angry, political. He wasn't rapping about champagne and gold chains, which was partly the, and still is to some degree, what hip hop can be about, the more popular side of it. He was talking about police brutality, racism, poverty. It was bold and controversial, even to the point where the vice president of the United States at the time, Dan Quayle, called for his music to be pulled from the shelf, saying there's absolutely no reason for a record like this to be published. And I suppose that goes to show what the white Republican side of America thinks, that art should be controlled, that artists should be controlled, that the narrative should be controlled. And people like Tupac at that time, and if you go further back into the California punk scene as well, these were people who were highly motivated and creative and wanted to say what had to be said. So somebody silly like Dan Quayle, who mostly couldn't even spell his own name, would say you can't have that message. But that was the only message at the time that counted. People like Dan Quayle coming out, and I suppose a later one would have been Al Gore's wife, when she came out with the explicit lyrics stickers on albums. It just made people listen harder. If somebody was criticised for their message or had a sticker put on it, people wanted it more and more and more. Tupac's next album, Strictly For My, I'll leave that word for you, and Me Against the World, only built on that momentum. He was poetic, passionate, and to some degree polarising. People felt he was speaking for them as opposed to them. And I think that's a massive difference between an artist, whether it be a rap artist or a country artist or a folk artist, anything. If people believe that you're talking for them, that connection will be much stronger. And I think that is one of the things that has given Tupac's output so much more longevity. He also started acting and got favourable reviews for films like Juice, Poetic Justice, and Above the Rim, which showed a different side to him. His hip hop, his rap persona was one of straight talking, of hard hitting, factual commentary, whereas his acting allowed to show more vulnerability. He was called a magnetic performer who could keep your attention on him while he was on screen. But unfortunately at that time, behind the scenes, his life was starting to unravel to some degree. Legal issues were piling up, assault charges, lawsuits, a time in prison. He was shot, arrested, sued, and glorified all in the same week. It said that Tupac lived fast, and it seemed that trouble was just about able to keep up with him. We'll stop for a moment here just to do what we always do in an episode, being part of the Euron podcast. It's a community, and one of the things that we love to do is to talk about the other shows that are on there. And in this episode, we're talking about the Dewey Pod Monster, and this is a podcast about consumption. I think which is something which is dear to all of our hearts. They cover all kinds of subjects, effectively anything that can be consumed, whether it's beer, movies, music, spirits. Nothing they say is off limit. One of the episodes I really enjoyed is Silver Bullet, the gas-powered wheelchair, and that is from the Stephen King story of the same name. So go give them a listen. Listen to as many episodes as you can. Give them a like, a share, a follow, and leave a really good review. So let's talk about the East Coast, West Coast. Now, this wasn't something that was created by the media. It wasn't Oasis versus Blair or something like that. This was the real deal, and this was, well, it was dangerous. You know, that these were armed gangs affiliated to record labels, which then had quite significant arguments. So if we have a look, we've got Death Row Records in Los Angeles. They became the face of West Coast rap. And that was where Tupac was signed. Meanwhile, Biggie Smalls, some people may know him as the Notorious B.I.G., was the East Coast king, representing Bad Boy Records in New York. The beef escalated after November 1994, when Tupac was shot 5 times at Quad Studios in Manhattan. Let's just pause there for a second. And I suppose it's a bit like the 50 Cent story as well. Tupac was shot 5 times. Okay? 5 times. Not Hollywood, 5 times. And he survived, but he was convinced that it wasn't a robbery. He believed that Biggie and Puffy Combs, or P. Diddy, or whatever we're calling him now, knew something and were involved. So it was almost like a hit, an attempt to quieten him down. Biggie denied it outright, but it was too late. The damage was done. That rivalry, that hatred between the East and West built and built and built. Tupac came out swinging, releasing hits, tracks, Hit 'Em Up, which was arguably one of the most vicious tracks in hip-hop history, because it was personal, brutal, and full of venom. The media fanned the flames like they do. They love a good old rumble, don't they? Magazines, radio shows, MTV, they all fed into the drama. It sounds a little bit dramatic now, 30 years later, to say that it became more than music. It became a war. But you've got to remember that these are armed gang members. On September the 7th, 1996, Tupac was in Las Vegas for a Mike Tyson fight. After the fight, he and Suge Knight got into a confrontation with a known Crips member, Orlando Anderson, at the MGM Grand. This has all been caught on security cameras, so we know that this bit definitely happened. Later that night, as Tupac and Suge were driving down the Las Vegas Strip, a white Cadillac pulled up beside them and opened fire. Tupac was hit 4 times. He died 6 days later, September the 13th, 1996. He was just as the word here, 25 years old. Despite millions of fans, national headlines, and dozens of witnesses, his murder remains officially unsolved. No arrests, no convictions, just questions. So talking of those questions then, let's dive into the conspiracies, the rabbit hole. And we'll start off with Old Faithful, okay? And that is Tupac faked his death. He's still alive. As with all famous people who pass away, their fans want this one to be the most true, and therefore it is the one that gets the most noise. It is the one that is spoken about in forums and the fans all of the time. Okay. So the theory is that his final album was released under the name Machiavelli. Okay. Now, it was a nod to an Italian philosopher called Machiavelli. Okay. And that guy, the Italian philosopher, he wrote about faking one's death. Okay. So what they've done is they've gone, that name looks like that name, that guy wrote about that, so he's still alive. Supporters point to the absence of a public funeral, alleged inconsistencies in hospital records. Claims are that Tupac was conscious when he was taken to hospital and even cracking jokes with hospital staff after the surgery. The official report states that he was in and out of consciousness and placed into a medically induced coma. Suge Knight himself said that Tupac was talking and laughing, but others close to him deny that. Some query the very, very fast cremation. Tupac was cremated the day after he died. And Frank Alexander, the guy who was in charge of the cremation, vanished or died soon after. A conspiracy on top of a conspiracy, or internet law. You decide. They back this up by the fact that there's no autopsy photographs ever officially released, and no open casket pictures, which could be explained by a myriad of reasons. Conspiracy theorists say that this cremation was too fast for somebody famous. There should have been a period of mourning and people should have been able to see him. Who knows? There were alleged inconsistencies in the autopsy. The report listed him as 6 feet tall, weighing 215 pounds. But friends and official records list him at 5'10" and around 165 pounds. Who knows? Who knows? The skeptics will say that the autopsy is fake or doctored. There was one leaked photograph which claimed to be from the autopsy. But again, it's poor quality, it's blurry, it's like every conspiracy photograph ever taken, inconclusive. Allegedly, there was little or no hospital security footage ever released from when he was admitted into UMC, which is University Medical Center of Southern Nevada. That's not so unusual. This is the 1990s. Not every single hospital had surveillance cameras in every single area. And they point to the fact that there's no photographs of him after the shooting. But that can be said that there's no real pictures of many people after they've been shot or died. There's no public photos of Tupac in the hospital, despite a massive media frenzy. The only post-shooting images from the inside of the car, from right before the ambush. And people just seem to think that because of the size of the drama, that somebody somewhere would have leaked something. Not necessarily true. You know, as with every conspiracy, it revolves around possible inaccuracies, and you know we can explain these away down. You know, bad record keeping, clerical errors. You know, people make terrible witnesses in times of high stress and pressure. There's no surprises that there are gaps in any story. Does it really add up to, you know, that his autopsy was faked, that his medical records were faked? I don't think so. Adding to the thought that Tupac may have faked his own death, you know, we have blurry photographs of somebody that might be Tupac. You know, there's a guy called Jamal who claimed to be Tupac living in New Mexico. But as always, there's zero proof. And I suppose it's a bit like the UFO conspiracies and the little green men and Bigfoot. It's always a blurry photo. You know, we've got, well, just about everybody has a camera phone which can do 4K video, but it's always a blurry video or a blurry photograph. You know, it'd be so much easier if somebody just went, hey, here's a 50 megapixel photograph of the guy I know is Tupac. Second theory is that the US government did it. Tupac was becoming too powerful, too political, and too influential. He was talking about uniting young black men, starting political movements, even forming a new political party. It sounded a bit too much like Malcolm X, MLK, the Panthers again. And that's where people say the government stepped in. Specifically, which was through the FBI's COINTELPRO project, which had been active through the 50s and 70s, specifically targeting black activists. The third conspiracy is that Suge Knight orchestrated it. He may have been in the car at the time, but miraculously only received a minor injury. It's said that Tupac was allegedly planning to leave Death Row Records, and that Suge knew that if he did leave, that would be the end of the record label. Suge denies this. Of course he does. He's not going to hold his hands up to something like that. But the whispers continue, whether they be from, in old interviews, from insiders. He's always denied it. Let's just look at that claim that Death Row Records would have collapsed without Tupac. When Tupac joined Death Row in 95, it was already a successful record label. He was signed as he came out of prison by Suge Knight, who paid his $1.4 million jail. In return, Tupac agreed to release 3 albums under the Death Row deal. As we've already said, his first, All Eyes on Me, in 96, the first double album for hip-hop, and was a massive and commercial and critical success. By mid-96, he was Death Row's most productive and bankable artist. Okay? So, why would they have collapsed without him? Well, Dr. Dre had already left Death Row. Dre left earlier in 96, citing creative differences and an increasingly toxic environment headed by Suge Knight. Dre was the label's co-founder and main producer, so this was a massive blow for them. You add to this that Snoop Dogg was very, very unhappy. And that would lead to Snoop leaving later in 98, but still, he was not happy. I think it's safe to say, and those around him said this to be fact, is that he was ready to leave. He wanted to leave and start his own label, have more creative and commercial control. But he was also paranoid about his relationship with Suge Knight, whether Suge was as loyal to him as he says he was. And he was concerned about the amount of money that Knight was moving out of Death Row at that time. So if he had left, if he'd lived and had left, then, you'd look at Death Row, they would lose its top rapper. They'd already lost its top producer. And in losing both of those, would have lost the biggest upcoming albums that they could have had on their reels. What happened after that was, well, Tupac died. Suge Knight went to prison. Death Row fell apart. It's by the early 2000s, it was auctioned off at, pennies on the dollar, and that was it. It was gone. The next one would be gangland retaliation. We talked earlier about the Crip member, Orlando Anderson. He was the guy that got into the fight with Tupac in the MGM lobby. Some say he was part of the Southside Compton Crips, and that Tupac's death was a retaliation. Anderson was a prime suspect. He denied involvement and was killed in a shootout 2 years later. Las Vegas police said they pursued the angle to its natural end. The next one, and possibly more interesting given recent events with one of the characters here, does this hold up more water now? Biggie and P. Diddy were behind it. The theory has been around forever, and it's the second one. He faked it, and these guys did it. They're the two main ones. That they'd taken out a contract on him, and that Tupac's murder was a payback for the shootings at the Quad Studios. Who knows? But, some of the stuff that's come out recently about P. Diddy has painted him in less than a favourable light. It wouldn't be a massive stretch to imagine him doing something else illegal. Okay. Biggie's family has denied it repeatedly. And there's never really been given any real evidence to it. Biggie himself was killed 6 months later in very, very, very similar circumstances. And his murder is unsolved too. So, let's have a look at Tupac's legacy then. So, as an artist, he sold over 75 million records. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. His music, his poetry, his interviews are studied in schools. For many, many, many people around the world, he's more than a rapper, more than a music artist, more than an actor. He's a symbol. He's a symbol of something to aspire to truth, to honesty. Whilst it can be said that, Tupac was a man of many contradictions. He was tender and violent, poetic and raw, spiritual and profane. He was, and I think this is one of the quotes that I like the most, he was deeply flawed, endlessly fascinating, and painfully human. And that's why people still talk about him. So what really happened to Tupac? Was it a gang hit, a government conspiracy, a record label betrayal, or did he pull off a Houdini and disappear? We will, as with all great conspiracies, never know the answer. Well, no, we may never know the answer. At the rate that the American government's going to release in JFK documents, we might find something at some point in the future. But it seems unlikely. It seems to be that this is another act of senseless, random violence that took Tupac from the world at the age of 25. Thanks for listening. As always, please like, share and subscribe. If you could leave a review as well, that helps us. I hope this was informative. I hope this was enjoyable for you. We'll see you again soon with another Between the Facts.